Morning. It's a pleasure to be here with Senator Rubio. I think Senator Rubio is one of the great leaders in the United States Congress on human rights. He speaks with moral clarity, which is something I believe is extremely important. And he's done that with human rights issues around the world. And yesterday we experienced the latest of an atrocity under the direction of President Assad of Syria, the use of gas against civilian populations. I say this is the latest because this has been going on for 6 years. The barrel bombing, the targeting of humanitarian workers, the targeting of hospitals, the use of chemical weapons. This is not an isolated example, but it is now on the front pages of our paper, and we must act. And that's why we're here, to make it clear that we cannot allow that type of conduct to go. What we do know, it was a Russian aircraft piloted by an Assad pilot that dropped a weapon that had the effect that reminds us of sarin. I don't know whether it was sarin or not, but I can tell you it had the impact much stronger than some of the chemicals that were used in recent months. We need action. To me, it starts with a clear U.S. policy that President Assad has no legitimacy as the leader of Syria and no future as the leader of Syria. And that should be made very clear by the pronouncements of our administration. Senator Rubio and I have introduced a resolution that we hope will be considered this week on the floor of the Senate that speaks to this atrocity and makes it clear the Senate position on it. We have also filed legislation, or will be filing legislation, concerning Syrian War Crimes Accountability Act that makes it clear also that Mr. Assad needs to be held accountable for his war crimes. And I want to underscore that point, if I might. We need to get him indicted. And it can be done in many different ways. But President Assad, must be held accountable for these war crimes. The easiest way is for the Security Council to pass a resolution establishing a special tribunal. But we know from reports from today that Ambassador Haley is having difficulty getting Russia to allow anything to go through the United Nations Security Council. We can operate through what's known as the IIIM, the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism in Syria that currently exists. They could pursue the investigation that would lead to President Assad being indicted as a war criminal. And yes, we want to make sure that everyone who is responsible is held accountable, not just President Assad. Which brings me to Mr. Putin and Russia. Mr. Putin has clearly been facilitating the activities in Syria by President Assad and is blocking action in the United Nations. And he needs to be investigated for culpability as a war criminal. There's legislation pending. Senator Rubio and I have worked on legislation that would impose additional sanctions on Russia and would also set up a way that we can protect against Russia propaganda and attacks on our democratic institutions. That bill should be marked up now and acted upon now. There's also the Caesar Syrian Civilian Protection Act, which imposes sanctions against those who are supporting the atrocities in Syria. It's named after Caesar, a person who both Senator Rubio and I have met, who brought photographs of what was happening in Syria to our attention several months ago. It was just recently we reshowed it during the 6th anniversary of the conflict in Syria. And I think it shocked our country, but it didn't shock enough for action. Now is the time for action. And let me just conclude on this comment. Later this month, we will have the Yom HaShoah commemorations for the Holocaust during World War II. We said then, never again. It's time that we meant it. And it starts with holding President Assad accountable.
Well, I too want to thank Senator Cardin. We have done a lot of work together lately. We filed a lot of bills together, almost invariably on human rights, and the fact that we're filing so many bills is a good thing in terms of the cooperation. The bad news is we have a lot of human rights issues around the world. We were together just a week ago with Vladimir Kara-Murza, who was obviously on 2 occasions was poisoned by Vladimir Putin's regime, and we find ourselves here again today on this issue. I just fear that we've reached a point where we're desensitized to all this. I mean, if this had happened at any other moment in the history of the world, if this had happened 5, 7, 10 years ago, this would be leading every newscast. People would be outraged. There would be a collective voice rising. Everybody here would be talking about it. Now it's just like another day in the life of this crazy world. This is outrageous. This is outrageous. You have a government that is using nerve agents against civilians, against its own people. And maybe it's mentioned, and I'm not blaming the press. I know there's a lot of other things to cover these days. But I think we've reached a point as a nation and as a world where we've become desensitized to human suffering on this scale, on this scope. I've had some people say to me, well, this is terrible what's happening in the Middle East, but what does it have to do with America? Why should it matter to us? Well, the first thing is because this is who we've been for over 2 centuries, a people that care about these sorts of things. It's embedded in our founding principles and the belief that all people have the right to life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. Not all Americans, all people. And we've lived out those principles, often imperfectly, but we've lived them out more than any other nation and any other civilization and any other society in human history. It makes us different. It makes us special. It makes me, and should make us, very proud to be Americans. But there's even a more practical reason. What's happening there is in our national security interest, and here's why. You see these images? You see these children? Imagine if you are that father, and that is your child, who has just been gassed to death by a regime. You will never, ever accept that regime as your rightful leader. And you are full of hatred and you are full of vengeance for what they have done to you and to your family. Put yourself in that position. And that person, many of them, are going to end up joining whichever organization in Syria has the guns and the money to fight Assad. That's what they're going to end up joining up with. And tragically, the groups on the ground, oftentimes in Syria with the most guns and the most money to fight Assad, are increasingly radical jihadist groups. There are many members of these radical jihadist groups that, quite frankly, aren't even jihadists, or at least weren't. But they joined because they're the only people they know that are fighting Assad, and they want to get him. They want to get him back for what he did to their child, what he did to their family. That's why Assad must go. As long as Bashar al-Assad is in Syria, there will be radical elements in Syria, not just fighting to get rid of him, but fighting ultimately to spread that ideology to other places. That's why it's in our national security interest. That's why it should matter to all Americans as well. This is important for us as a people because it goes to the core of who we are. But it's also in our national security interest. And we can't ignore it. We also can't ignore the countries that made this possible. If you are a country led by Vladimir Putin like Russia is, who is going before the world and saying this was the rebels, this wasn't the regime, that's absurd. That is fake news at its highest. It's grotesque. That they could say it with a straight face is even more troubling. This would never have been able to be possible had they not had the cover that Vladimir Putin has given Assad. And it leads to this question. Anyone who supports Bashar al-Assad in doing these sorts of things and tries to cover for him on the international stage and actually votes at international organisms to protect him from sanction, they are at a minimum accomplices in war crimes, which is why I reiterate my belief that Vladimir Putin is a war criminal who is assisting another war criminal in killing his own people and gassing innocents. And for me, a statement is not enough. A resolution is important. It's not enough. There needs to be a level of outrage. This needs to become a priority. Otherwise, we have lost our compass as a people and as a nation. And more importantly, for those who care deeply about our national security, we have left behind a situation that will only get worse. And that only emboldens and makes populations vulnerable to and incentivizes people to join radical jihadist movements that seek to target us around the world and here at home. And so I hope we can make this a priority, and I hope it can be a bipartisan one. It should be. And it's one that I hope we can not just speak in one voice in the Senate about, but ultimately that we can support a series of measures in conjunction with multiple organisms in our government to address this once and for all in a way that once again restores our proper and rightful role in the world and our defense of the principles that make us a unique and special people.
Senator, you said that there was no coincidence, in your opinion, that this happened after Secretary of State Tillerson's comments earlier in the week. Can you expand on that?
It's my belief that if you're Bashar al-Assad and you read that it is no longer a priority of the United States to have you removed from power, I believe that that is an incentive to act with impunity. Now, I don't believe this is the first chemical attack this year. It's the first we've seen of potential sarin gas used in quite a while, probably in 3 years. So does this mean he wouldn't have ultimately done it anyway? Probably would have ended up doing it anyways at some point. But I do believe that when you read, and I'm not, by the way, believe that that was Secretary Tillerson's intention, nor do I believe that that's what he thought would happen. But if you're Bashar al-Assad and they're basically sending you a signal that in the end we just want you to finish this war quickly and we don't like you, we think you're a bad guy, we think you do bad things, but we think you're better than the alternative, and at this point our priority is just ISIS, and we don't really care what happens after that in the short term, I think that is, in my view, something that would encourage him to do something like what we've just seen. And so I personally do not believe that it's coincidental.
Senator, following up to that, have you spoken to the president? He campaigned as a non-interventionist president and even indicated he wanted to see Assad as an ally potentially someday. Have you spoken to him about whether those views have changed? And could both of you react to the news that we've gotten out of the White House that Steve Bannon has been removed from the National Security Council?
I don't know anything about the second report. When did that come out?
Just now.
Oh, well.
You get a good decision.
I don't know anything about it, so I can't comment.
Should he
on
be
it.
on the National Security Council?
The president has the right to choose whoever he wants to serve on that. And on the first point, I've spoken to the president. I think the administration is well aware of my views on foreign policy. I certainly tried to articulate them on 12 separate occasions on debate stages throughout the primary process. And I have had conversations with them afterwards about general foreign policy topics. But I have not had the sort of conversation you're asking about where I basically have outlined a different way forward beyond my interactions with the National Security Council and with the White House on specific foreign policy issues.
Senator, you just...
Which senators? Two here.
Senator Cardin, anything like Mr. Bannon?
Yeah, first,
How come we're getting it
if that is fact true, it's my first hearing of it. I'd be very pleased that he's not on the National Security Council. My hope is that he would have no role in government at all, that he would be completely out, because I do think that that's not the type of advice the president should be receiving in regards to diversity and tolerance and the values of our country. So that would be my view. I want to just, if I might just comment briefly, you know, we don't know all the facts concerning what happened yesterday. We do know, based upon previous activities, that President Assad is responsible for what happened. We do know it was facilitated by the Russians. We know that by what they've been able to do. We don't know the specific chemical. We don't know the exact plane. We don't know the exact pilot, those type of information. But if we go by what's happened in the past, it's very clear that the responsibility here rests with President Assad, facilitated by President Putin.
What can you realistically do at this point? What can the United States realistically do at this point to deal with Assad? He's already sanctioned to here. There's been 6 years of opposition, failed efforts in the UN Security Council because of Russia. So what options are there really?
Well, there are several things. First, you know, obviously we can have a clear policy that he cannot remain as president of Syria. Yes, we need to bring all parties together, but it can't have a future with President Assad. Secondly, there are additional sanctions that can be imposed, secondary sanctions, those who are supplying the type of equipment that's being used by the Assad regime. So there's additional sanctions that can be imposed. And third, there's ways that the United States, working with other countries, can start a process that will lead to indictments for war crimes by President Assad, and we should do that now.
Senator Rubio, let me ask you,
Let me just answer. This is my view, obviously. I don't know if Senator Cardin shares this view, and he will speak for himself. But my view is that one of the things that we hope to be able to achieve in Syria, and I believe was a lot easier to do 5 years ago when I advocated for it, but I still think potentially possible and necessary, is there has to exist within Syria a non-jihadist Sunni movement that serves as an alternative to the Assad regime. Now, by no means should we anticipate that this is a group that's going to be capable of turning Syria into Australia within the next 3 or 5 years. It's a difficult endeavor. But I do believe it is possible for us to work in multiple ways to empower a Sunni alternative to the Alawi government that is killing and abusing its own people and is aligned with the government in Tehran and has empowered Hezbollah and within Syria as well. I think that's a critical component. How that tactically is carried out is something that would probably be discussed in a much different setting than this. It would involve different elements of American power. But I do think in the absence of that, the only combatants on the ground that people ever hear about are radical jihadists, both the former al-Nusra groups and the ISIS groups, and then the groups aligned with Assad, which are bad actors themselves, Hezbollah, Iran, Russia, and Assad's regular forces. There has to be a third element, and that is Syrians. Many of the people resisting Assad as jihadists are not just there to resist Assad. They want to take over a piece of territory from which they can expand and create a caliphate. There has to be an alternative to them that is not jihadists, that are Syrians, that care about the future of Syria and have the space and the wherewithal to be able to have a meaningful role in the future of Syria as an alternative to Assad or Iranian influence.
You've called now Bashar al-Assad a war criminal, Vladimir Putin a war criminal. You got a president of the United States that's not calling for Assad's removal anymore and says we have to be cognizant of the political realities in that country, in Syria. You've also got investigations across Capitol Hill of President Trump and his ties to Russia. Do you think those investigations right now are undermining his ability to be an effective commander-in-chief on this issue and more broadly?
No, I don't believe that. That's a separate endeavor. It's an important one. As I'm involved in that in the Intelligence Committee. It's an important part of oversight. For me, it's not just a singular event. It's an ongoing practice. And the Foreign Relations Committee, we've heard from our allies in Europe that are confronting this. And this isn't going to end in 2016. We'll continue to see efforts on active measures to undermine our democratic institutions. It's part of Vladimir Putin's asymmetrical plan to undermine a world order that he believes constrains Russia, which is not true, but that's his belief. On the first point, sure, there are policy disagreements, and my hope is that as a member of the Senate, we will continue to urge and nudge the administration in a direction that we think would be more productive and that, quite frankly, serves our national interests. And I believe there are people in the administration that share these views that I've addressed with you, and it's still, I know it feels like a long time. It's only been a couple months. And the president is still formulating and the administration is still formulating a foreign policy strategy for different parts of the world. Sometimes events overtake your ability to sit down and draft those. And so in the immediate term, I would just hope that I am successful at convincing them, or these key decision makers, that a different approach from what they potentially have discussed publicly is the right approach moving forward.
Senator Rubio.
I just said, one second. We'll take one question there, and then I think it's going to be it. Yes.
Do you think the goal of achieving a non-jihadist Sunni contingent of fighters in Syria can be achieved without a stepped-up military commitment from the United States? And to both of you, what are your thoughts about President Trump's statement on the Syria chemical weapons attack that included some blame leveled on President Obama?
Well, let me start with the second question. We're not looking backward right now. We're looking forward. We've got to be able to deal with the current situation. He is the commander-in-chief. He is the president of the United States. We need to know President Trump's policies for countering these atrocities and the challenges we have. I agree completely with Senator Rubio. It's not only against the humanity values of the world, it's against our national security interests. And what is the President of the United States suggesting? What is his policy? How can we make it clear that we will not tolerate that type of activity under a Trump presidency? That's what we're looking for.
And I would just add to that, if I may, I don't think it's a secret that I disagree with many of the decisions made by the Obama administration on foreign policy. But that presidency's over. We have a new presidency. Bottom line is the people who killed these children are Bashar al-Assad with the assistance of Vladimir Putin's military forces. That's who should be held responsible, 100% responsible. They are the ones that are gassing their own people. That's where the responsibility should lie, and it is my personal view that any effort to take even an iota of blame away from the people truly responsible does not further the cause that we seek to make and bring light to today.
You get the last word. Yeah.
Frank, go ahead. Senators, from a strategic standpoint, why do you think the Assad regime would decide to use chemical weapons now when they knew there was going to be such international blowback for an attack like this? Why would they decide to use chemical weapons now?
Because international blowback means you get a really nasty letter from members of the UN, not even the Security Council, because it'll be vetoed. That means you get a bad press release and a few bad articles. And within 72 hours, everyone will collectively move on to the next big issue of the moment. That's why. He's fighting for survival. I think he's willing to take the risk of a couple bad articles in exchange for being able to wipe out anyone who he believes stand this way. Even that means thousands and hundreds of civilian and children, Syrians, must die as a result. I honestly, truly believe he believes there will be no price to pay in the short term, and perhaps in the long term, for acting with impunity. And he made that calculus.
If I could just underscore Senator Rubio's point, look what happened today. I don't know all the details, but he's being protected in the United Nations by Russia. So as long as Russia has his back, he doesn't believe anybody can touch him. So he'll do whatever he wants to do. He wants to show that he's in control of his country, and he'll do whatever he wants to. And obviously, he's playing to a limited constituency within Syria. And he'll be able to do that unless the international community says, no, we will not allow this to continue. And that's what we're here to say. The United States must show international leadership so this activity ends, and it ends now. Thank you all very much.
I'm going to answer one question from in Spanish.
¿Cómo cree usted que Estados Unidos tiene que abordar ese tema en Siria primero? Y segundo, ¿cree usted que fue apropiado que el presidente le haya echado la culpa a la administración anterior?
Yo creo que la culpa de este ataque es 100% la culpa de Bashar al-Assad y sus aliados en Moscú, Vladimir Putin. Y en temas de cómo podemos llegar adelante, primero es usar todo lo que podemos para ayudar a través de la ONU, condenar estos ataques. Segundo, investigar cómo podemos crear un grupo dentro de Siria, una fuerza de sunnis dentro de Siria, que no son radicales, que sean una alternativa a Bashar al-Assad a largo plazo. Y nunca debemos aceptar que él es legítimamente el líder de ese país. Este individuo es un criminal, es un asesino. Y es ayudado por otro asesino criminal llamado Vladimir Putin. Thank you.
Thank you all very much.